Okay, today is May 19th, 2014, and this is Brent Björkman, Director of the Kentucky Folklife Program, continuing my work on the Ranger Lore Project about the working lives of rangers, mostly in and around the Mammoth Cave area. And today I'm with some special guests at their home. Could you tell me who you are? And if you're not working at the park or did, can you tell me what your the position that you left?
I'm Joy Medley Lyons, and I worked at Mammoth Cave National Park from 1979 until recently, until 2013, actually July of 2013, and I retired as the Chief of Program Services in the Division of Interpretation. And what else do you want to know?
No, that's good.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
And who are you, sir?
My name is David Lyons, and I actually came kind of through the back door to the National Park Service. I spent some time in the early 70s working with the Corps of Engineers on several projects in Florida, and especially in the Everglades and lower half of Florida. And you learn a lot about the environment through the Corps of Engineers, and it's not always how things should be. So that's really where I started going back to school. I studied plant science, but I stayed working summers there for quite some time, and then after the service I came to Kentucky, and actually there was an opening for a seasonal interpreter, and that was in 78, I guess. The winter of the blizzard, I think that was 78. And I took that, basically took an intermittent job with the Park Service. It was an interpretive position, which wasn't really what I knew about, but it got me in the door, and I actually stayed with the Park Service until 85. And when I finished, I worked both in resource management, but I finished as a law enforcement ranger. And there were a lot of issues with the Park Service that were hard to deal with, and it was better that I parted under fairly good feelings.
Uh-huh.
So I left that and went to the Postal Service.
Uh-huh.
And stayed there until 2000.
Till you hit 55 and you're at the door.
2004, I believe I retired from the Postal Service.
And what do you do now?
Mostly I just take care of her. No, I do, when I can, a lot of historic preservation work. Stone, wood, glass, you name it, just about anything you do with old houses, we kind of do.
Mm-hmm.
And been very fortunate. I get to work in a lot of different places. Of course, that also means you're gone a lot, and now I can't really do that.
Right. Joy, how did you come to the job in 78, 79?
In 79. Well, I was an Owensboro, Kentucky native, and I wound up going to Western Kentucky University in 76, the bicentennial year. And the summer of the winter of 78, 79, my roommate, Terry Jerica, who was a graduate student in folk studies, actually, back then, under the jurisdiction of Linwood Mondale and Bert Feintuck and all that, Cam Collins, all that bunch. She came home with an extra application that it looked like a census form. It was so full of pages and little circles to fill in and what have you. And she said, I've got an extra one of these applications for the Park Service. Do you want one? And I said, what's it for? And she said, well, this one is for a summer job at Mammoth Cave. And I said, sure, okay. So I filled it out. It took forever. They wanted to know if I could use a chainsaw. They wanted to know if I could handle money. They wanted to know if I knew much about ornithology. I mean, it was just like everything. It covered every spectrum of the natural and cultural world around us. I filled it out, and luckily I had a lot of experience working with cash, with money at previous jobs, and Terry unfortunately had not. She worked with museums and did really things that had a lot to do with cultural studies. But I was selected to work in the ticket office at Mammoth Cave National Park, and poor Terry walked away empty-handed. But she did get a job the next summer. She did get into the guide force the next summer, which was also my first summer in the guide force in interpretation. So my first year on the rolls as a seasonal, I was actually working back in the ticket office, and I think that was a really good experience because it helped me to have empathy, first of all, for the visitors, and empathy for the questions they had, so the things that the guides didn't necessarily experience. So that when I went into the guide force, I was able to show, I think, a little bit more empathy with the visitors than I would have otherwise. Mm-hmm. Especially with their age and concerns that they had, because they would tend to ask us the questions in the ticket office about their concerns physically, and should I really take the baby with me on the tour, and I was always like, yeah, take that baby with you, go for it. Whereas the guides would be like, no, don't bring the baby with you, because 9 times out of 10, as soon as they had discovered the echo in the cave, they love that echo.
What kind of training did you have, having that first position, not being interpreter? Did you have some introductory familiarization trips into the cave, and how did they work you into that?
We did. We actually had a week of training, which is now 2 weeks, but we went into a week of, the first couple of days were just orientation to the National Park Service and Mammoth Cave National Park, where they talked about the importance of the uniform and ethics, just that type of thing. Ethics are it's a really big deal in the government and in the Park Service. And then the last 3 days, they brought in rehire employees to go along with us into the cave on cave tours. So I'm thinking that the ones that we saw that year were the historic tour, which was 2 hours, and they took us on the at the time it was the Frozen Niagara tour, but it was 1 hour and 15 minutes, and you walked in like a quarter of a mile and back out a quarter of a mile through the formations. And and at that time it was the half-day tour, which is now called the Grand Avenue Tour, and heck, they may be changing that name again too, I don't know. But that was a 4.5-hour trip, 4 miles. And then I think the reason they took the rehires with this is because they could share information with us along the way as we went on the tours, because they took us in with regular public. We didn't do a separate training trip. We were actually in the cave with the general public, and at that time the tours were really big.
So how did you you two obviously met in the park, or something like that? What's that origin story? Was it about the time you started when you met?
The first week we were there.
The first week you were there?
Because he came in, I guess, on that Wednesday or Thursday, whatever day it was that they brought the rehires back. And I remember I was sitting down in the guide lounge on an old orange sofa, and that dated back to the 1960s, to Mission 66. Anyway, I looked up as some of the rehires were coming in the door, and David was one of them coming in, and I remember looking at him and thinking he was really cute, but I also thought, how can he wear his hair that long? They don't let you wear your hair that long here in the uniform, but his hair is long. And then I remember thinking, I hope he's not married. So, what's your version?
I don't remember the first year.
But then you got to know each other through socialization.
We did. We did, just through getting together at some of the parties and get-togethers they had at the park. But also, the place you really get to know each other is in the guide lounge. because in between cave tours, lunchtime, there's just a lot of time and opportunity to talk, especially if you're working with somebody on the same schedule that day, because you do all your tours together. You have all of the schedule, the whole schedule that day is between the two of you. So that's one thing that's kind of neat about the guide force is you have the opportunity, depending on who you work with, to get to know each other really pretty, I want to say intimately, although it sounds kind of funny to say that about us because we did get to know each other pretty intimately, but we had a lot in common, and as most people do in that kind of work, you know. And we've talked before, you and I, about the fact that there have been a lot of married couples come out of the National Park Service just because, first of all, because of common interests. So, and that's probably true of a lot of occupations.
How does that work with married couples? I mean, I think that's one of the things that was intriguing about this application to the Library of Congress, because that was one of the things I talked about.
It's very different now than it was.
Tell me about how it was
before. Now the interest is looking after the couple. They're basically a team, and everyone really works with them. Back when we were there, that was not the case at all. And very typically, if it was a male and female both in the Park Service, it was not the female that was tended to. In fact, when she came on to the guide force, there were really very few women there at that time, and it was really made it really difficult for couples.
One of the things about couples too is just that a lot of our friends wound up having to work in different parks to be able to each stay in the National Park Service. So sometimes there was a great deal of distance between them geographically. And then sadly, I mean, like when other people are getting their vacations over holidays, Park Service people don't tend to take vacations over holidays because they're the ones who are having to work the holidays. That's where the people are coming to. So they took atypical time off, you know, at times when they could get together with their spouses, and each of them would take turns moving, you know, visiting from one park to the other. And very rarely did they get a chance to take off at the same time and go somewhere as a couple or as a family. And sometimes it was families that were also separated. With us, you know, David and I think we had some trying times there at the very beginning. And when I first started at the park as a woman, I'll be honest, I think, you know, David was saying that it's different now with couples. I truly think that part of the reason that it's different and that there's more empathy and more willingness to work with couples is that women came up into the Park Service, and that there's a trait within women who, especially people my age, who did come up through the hard times in the Park Service, to pay closer attention to family, to pay closer attention to children's needs, couples' needs. And back then in the 70s and certainly in the 60s, it was men calling the shots. Nothing against men, I like men, but they really had a different perspective. First of all, they thought women needed to be at home, and they had a hard time accepting women coming into the Park Service, especially in the uniform. And that shows up when you look at the early uniforms for women. Oh my gosh. The first women's uniform, I mean, and you need to look for some photographs. Oh my gosh. The first women's uniform looked like a 1960s era airline stewardess. Seriously. With the boots, like white, I won't say go-go boots, they were just boots, skirt, and a different kind of hat, not the Stetson. And then they modified from there. And eventually they went into another style, and they finally got them into some pants. And Then finally, a number of years later, we're in uniforms similar to the men's, but with a different cut, obviously, for women. So those first uniforms were, I think they were actually an embarrassment to the Park Service. And can you imagine being on the historic tour on Mammoth Cave, going up that tower with a skirt on? And and it wasn't a long skirt. It was crazy. I mean, like above the knee kind of a skirt. Well above the knee kind of a skirt. It was just ridiculous. And then, and we're talking Mammoth Cave. What if you worked at Yellowstone? What if you worked at Grand Canyon? I mean, and you're out in the elements, and that's what they got you in? Just ridiculous.
When you started in the late 70s, what was the issue at that time?
At that time, the issue was pretty much what it is right now. We didn't have pockets on the back side of the pants then. We do now. And I always remember saying to the girls at work, last thing I need on my butt is 2 pockets to draw attention to it. But we had pretty much the same uniform. And it's not changed that much in the last 30 years, truly. What's changed is the producers, or who creates the uniform. Whereas before in the 70s, it was pretty much all American-made products, and especially the boots and the hiking gear, that kind of stuff. And now almost all of it is foreign-made. It's internationally made. So, and that's something that doesn't sit well with a lot of the people who work for the Park Service. And the sizing is different than it used to be too, because I think partially because things are made in other countries. The quality's not as good as it used to be, but they're more expensive.
The attitude with women didn't stop with coworkers and management. It was really the same thing with a lot of the public. And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard someone ask, are you a member of the Ranger Auxiliary, or are you the guide's helper, or you know?
Yeah, I bet he's taught you a lot over the years. And then the guide up front, the lead guide and the trailing. Well, if it was your turn to trail the trip and not lead it, people would say, I bet you've learned a lot from him over the years. I'm like, well, no, not really, because he just started at MMA and I'm helping train him. That kind of stuff.
It's a shock. It was a shock too.
They always assumed that the man had been there longer. And there was a time when, that was definitely true. And when they come to the information desk, it was usually the man that they'd come up to first. Even if you were there, like if there were 2 women and 1 man working the information desk, and the 2 women were standing there with no one there, they would stand in line and wait behind somebody to talk to the guy instead of just going over to the ladies. So we would be assertive and say, can we help you with anything? Well, they'll look and, point at the guy and like, no, it's okay. We can answer whatever questions you got. It's fine. You just rolled with the punches. You just got used to it and took care of it. Amish. Now those we just said, they're going to wait. Nobody, and sometimes the Mennonites too, because they would come up and talk to the women, and the women in the group didn't come up and talk to anybody. But they did enjoy the cave. They enjoyed the cave tours. If you went and talked to them, if you approached them and spoke to them, they would respond. They were fine. But it was in that setting, the men would come forward and get the information and that sort of thing. Which I don't know much about Amish. You probably want to know more about the Amish than I do, or Mennonites. But that was kind of the trait. That was my experience with them.
So you did a lot of training yourself about gender during the time, and teaching the public about changing roles in American working life.
Yes. Now they have women's studies, and there's also, I've often thought I could have a good time going and doing some on-site talks with people who teach women's studies. I've just not done it yet, but that's the kind of thing I'd like to do, is just to get out. And I've always enjoyed the academic environment anyway. So maybe at some point that's something that I can do. And just talk with them.
When you all met, I guess also I'm curious about the, of course, the working lives. What was it like to the places you lived in, housing on site. Can you explain to me how that evolved over the years, or how you started, and what was that environment like? Was that another piece of getting close to one another after hours? And was it communal eating, or was it communal socializing? And
that's a good question. One thing that was really common, because it was a national park, and it's true in a lot of national parks that are even more isolated than Mammoth Cave, the NPS community would come together in the evenings sometimes to have potlucks and celebrate birthdays or what have you, because a lot of times they were so far from towns, you know, that your community was like your own little small city. So that's who you depended on for your socializing and your entertainment. And with David and I, we participated in things like that over at the seasonal housing and the permanent housings. The housing circle at Mammoth Cave was built by the CCC. So those are historic structures. And we've got one of the CCC houses was across the river, called Maple Springs. And then Mission 66 brought seasonal apartments to the mix. I guess before that, seasonals had to camp. I don't know what they did. But so we got 3 buildings over there with 4 apartments in each building and 1 bedroom in each apartment. So you have 2 people of the same gender, unless they're married, living over in those seasonal apartments. We lived beginning after we got married in September of '81 over at the Mammoth Cave Baptist Church in Mammoth Cave National Park. We wound up living at Maple Springs because David was in law enforcement, and he, for all intents and purposes, was the North District Ranger. And so we had mandatory housing. He had to live in the park. And prior to that, we had lived outside the park in Cave City for just a few months before we got married. And then got married in September, moved into Maple Springs in October. And that's where we lived from October of '81 until January of '86. And I loved it. Loved living over there. It was very isolated, but isolation is not necessarily a bad thing for a young married couple. We did have a campground down the road from us that sometimes caused us to have visitors at the place. Well, you know, at the house. They would think it was a ranger station, like an office, so people would stop by there.
Our heat was a wood stove, and campers would come and steal our firewood.
Yeah, quite frequently. And when you're talking about a Boy Scout troop, they can haul off some wood, and we were having to basically pay for our firewood. You know, we were buying it. We could go out and get some down in deadwood in the park, but good grief, that'd take forever. So we were buying ricks of wood for our fireplace, and that was our primary and only heat source, really. I mean, we had fuel oil
when it worked,
right, but we didn't really use it that much. But the house itself had an attic space and 2 original bedrooms, a living room and a kitchen and a basement. And then sometime in the 60s, I think they added on another small bathroom and a bedroom. And the garage, I think, might have been original, and then kind of became an attachment to the house when they added on. Lots of stonework, of course, the typical NPS architectural style. But David and I had really memorable years there. Our daughter Becca was born while we lived there. She was born in June of '84. So it's one of my favorite places in the park. As a matter of fact, I can't usually go over there and drive by without getting a little teary-eyed, because it
doesn't look the same.
No, it doesn't look the same at all anymore, especially the roadway. When we lived over there, the road was single lane and should have really been one way, but it was a 2-way road.
The North out of Park Road?
Yes. Well, actually, because the main road that you just drove in on this morning, across to the ferry when you were coming back from Paul and Rich's house, it was hard to pass. It was gravel. And then it went to, what do you call that hard pack stuff?
The chip and seal.
Yeah, the chip and seal stuff. And then they finally, years later, widened it a little bit and paved it. But when we lived there, we were out in God's country. And then when you took the left to go where Maple Springs was, it was even narrower. Kind of went along the edge of a big sinkhole and on back to Maple Springs campground. But where we lived, we had the house and a barn, and there was an old stone building back there. And other people have used it since, not for, but a few people have used it since we moved out to live there. You know, a couple of people like Eddie Wells and 2 other people that I can think of, but who are no longer at the park. But we also had a dog that showed up like 2 days after we moved into the park. He was a lab mix. His name was Bo. We named him. We figured if he found us, we needed him. And so we had him there for about 4 years. Matter of fact, he died out in the barn in November, right before we moved in January. It was a horrendous experience.
Yes, it was.
It was. We loved that dog. David and I were just talking about it the other day. We were like, we had 2 dogs in our lives that we will never forget. Bo was one, and then another one was Maggie, and I was like, and she was an Australian Shepherd. I was like, but we only had 3 dogs. That didn't make Lady sound very good. She was a Dalmatian. But we didn't have her as long, and that dog was wild. But yeah, we've had we love pets. We love animals, obviously. So
that was kind of atypical. Was that atypical? That this seems like a good situation you two were in.
It was. But with the mandatory housing, we had some issues sometimes. Like they told us we had to have a telephone. Well, the phone line over there that ran over to Maple Springs only ran over there for Maple Springs. It was miles of phone line, blah, blah, blah. And the phone bill was $90 a month.
Back
we were
then.
like, yeah, and we're talking
$1982.
Yeah, $90. We were like, no, we don't want a phone. You have to have a phone. No, we don't. You have to have a phone. You know, David has to have a phone. If you're saying he has to have a phone, then you pay for it, because we're not going to. We paid our rent. We're talking, our rent was $300 a month.
Which was considerably higher than anything surrounding the park.
Right, and was the highest, actually Maple Springs, other than the superintendent's house, was the highest rated rent in the park. Because it was the second largest house in the park, other than the superintendent's house, which was over on the, well, off the circle, but you've seen it, I think. You know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's a chunk when you're making, what, $17,000 a year?
Yeah, we were not making a lot of money. And I think that was the primary reason that David left the Park Service too, was just the money issue. He left the Park Service and went straight to almost, what, $3 an hour or more at the post office.
I doubled my salary in the first year.
Crazy. I mean, I was glad to have it, but we had to, when he left the Park Service though, we had to leave Maple Springs. So, because that was mandatory housing for the ranger, law enforcement ranger. I worked at the park, but I was not law enforcement. I was interpretation. So David, we came over and bought this piece of property right here and went and got a log house kit. Basically ordered a log house, they put up the shell, and then David built literally everything else in here over the years. Some things have not even actually been finished yet, but a lot of it we do as we can, you know, as we can afford it. It's a work in progress, but I miss Maple Springs. It's just, it is near and dear to my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And even as for Rebecca, and she doesn't really remember it. She remembers Bo, and at the back door, 'cause she would go to the back door and talk to him through the glass, you know, when she was little. But she says she remembers that. I guess she does, because I don't remember ever telling her about it. So.
Right.
Sometimes you have young memories.
Mm. So, tell me a little bit about the working environment when you've seen a lot because you were there for quite a few years. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, David, certainly you can chime in about your experiences, but
Yeah.
what about how does it go? How does work go in the park? How do people treat one another? How do they learn from one another? How do you pass things on? Is there a philosophy, either a personal or something that's stated by the Park Service that, you know?
Well, yeah, obviously there are standard operating procedures. Each cave tour, for instance, has a standard operating procedure for what you're supposed to do, how you do it. written up, those are actually written by the staff.
Right.
So I would ask some of the staff, okay, you guys, you two work on this SOP. Really look at it. Look at how we need to do this cave tour. Look at things that have been issues for us, and let me see what you get, what you got. And so a lot of things changed when we brought the staff into the mix for making decisions about what the tours are named, or what routes we're going to, how the route needs to be changed, how many stops do we need to make. That was not the case years ago. Years ago it was by the book. You don't change the book. You don't reinterpret the book. You do what it says. And everybody was worried about timing on cave tours. And nowadays we just tell people, look, the tour is 2 hours. We want to get in and we want to get out in 2 hours. But the thing is, that can't be your driving force. If you have somebody on the tour that's having difficulty, that's your priority. You don't push them and get them out in 2 hours, you know. So there are some things that over the years have become more visitor-focused, visitor-friendly, I think, and also more employee-focused and employee-friendly, so that they have, I like to believe anyway, more voice in what's decided and how things happen, because they're the ones who live it. They're the ones who have to deal with what's going on, like with white nose syndrome at the park right now. It doesn't make sense for people in management in another office to decide how that's going to work or decide what needs to be changed. They don't know. They're not there doing it. So the people who are doing the job can come to you and feel free to make suggestions. You may have some insight that they don't know that you share with them and say, you know, I would like to be able to do it that way, but if we do, then this is going to happen. And so you just have this back and forth discussion. We were talking with like Joel Gillespie. He was one of my favorite people to bounce things off of, because Joel is he's a thinker. And he would say to me, let me think about that. I'll come back to you. And then he would come and we'd talk about it. And I knew that he would. I knew that he would give it some thought. I knew he would come back. And he wasn't the only one. Certainly there are many others who are the same way. Johnny Meredith, Chuck DeCroy, Leslie Price. She's a real deep thinker. Sometimes, and Kathy, of course, Kathy Prophet, people in the office. We all work together as kind of like a think tank. But even though we were the higher graded, like I was a GS 12, Kathy's a GS 11, the other ones I mentioned there are GS 9s. Then you jump down to the guide force, the people who deal every day with the stress and the emergency things and even deaths in the cave, are GS 5s, which is not high enough. Mm-hmm. The Park Service has a real problem with undergraded staff. Too much responsibility for their pay, but they do it.
More so now.
You're right, but they do it. They get the job done regardless. And some people will say, "Well, you government folks get paid in benefits," and that's partially true. I know you get your sick leave, you get vacation time off, supposedly, but the management can tell you, no, you can't take that time off because we're busy that week. You're going to have to wait till a slower week.
It's probably a little different now, but with me, from April through early November, there was no vacation. You didn't do it. You didn't even ask for it.
Back then, no. It's not true now. But back then, that was definitely the case.
Yeah,
and partly it was because of staffing numbers, too, I think.
Well, yeah.
And sometimes I think it was just because of orneriness on the supervisor's part.
Could be.
Where would you... May to November, you were on duty. Where would somebody like rangers like yourselves, where would you take time off? What would you do on time off?
What did we do?
I think one of the favorite things that we did was just drive, just get away
from the park. And even if it wasn't an overnight thing, David and I both have always enjoyed just driving and seeing the country and visiting little podunk places. We never were. I'm not saying we didn't go to places like Charleston, South Carolina. We did. I love that place. We mentioned that earlier off camera, but we would go to Red River Gorge, places like that to camp. That's where I realized that I was pregnant with Becca, because we got down on a hiking trail. We got down to the very bottom of this ravine, and I was like, we gotta walk back up out of this ravine. And I was so wiped out and said, David, I've got to be pregnant. I have got no juice left in me at all. And sure enough, I was. That was kind of a strange situation. Yeah, to realize my body's not going to get me out of here very easily today. Whereas before I would have had no trouble with it whatsoever. Where else did we travel to? We didn't have a whole lot of money to travel much. We went to Michigan. We would go to see family.
Went to Eastern Kentucky a lot.
We did go to Eastern Kentucky a lot. Breaks Interstate Park. And then just all over Eastern Kentucky, honestly. Especially down the lower eastern part. Cumberland Gap, national, historic site. And we went to Big South Fork, took the kids on the train.
But parks.
But parks. But not necessarily, yeah. And some state parks. We went to a lot of Kentucky state parks, and we would sometimes stay overnight at those. Actually, we usually did stay overnight at the state parks. Like Cumberland Falls. Actually, that's where David proposed to me, was Cumberland Falls. And then, the early days, that's where we went, really, was Eastern Kentucky. You're right. I never had sat back and thought about it, but that's where we tended to go to most.
We did.
Did you guide together? Guide cave tours together?
We went on cave tours, I think I can remember, twice. And I wouldn't guide either one of them. I made him guide and I trailed because I was embarrassed to guide in front of him. I don't know why, I didn't want to do it. So he did. We had two very different styles of guiding. And it's like David has got this very slow, methodical, every sentence that comes out of his mouth, it sounds like he's thinking about it. Whereas I was just the Jabberwocky, but I mean, I had the information in my head, but I would just I felt like, I think really it was more, I just wanted to hear him. I just wanted to see him in front of a group and listen to him, because he's usually more of a listener than a talker. And I didn't get the opportunity much to see him in the cave. They really made a point of not pairing us together. And once they realized there was a relationship there, and then see when he went into law enforcement, well, and that was really fairly, like what, a year and a half later, something like that?
It wasn't even then.
We didn't have the opportunity to go in the cave together. Except for when I was in the cave on a tour and we had a carry-out or something like that. And then law enforcement and maintenance guys got called in to help carry somebody out of the cave because they gave out or got sick or, heaven forbid, passed away, which did happen some. And I remember working one fatality with David outside the cave.
Tell me about that.
On a road accident. I'd rather he talked about that.
Okay, that's fine. Or not, yeah, right.
No, you can talk about it.
Can you tell me about law enforcement? You switched to law enforcement and what that was like, and then maybe, I know you've been away for a while, but maybe how you perceive it to be today, or was there differences, or maybe share some stories about that?
There's definitely a difference now. Now the Park Service actually admits they have law enforcement people.
Yeah.
And they pay them and such. They work on their hazardous duty pay and
buy them gear.
Yeah, and buy them gear. We had to buy our own gear, if we were somewhere in the park and went into a public building, we had to strip all weapons. We could not carry a weapon into a public building.
The hotel, for instance.
Yeah, even the hotel to eat lunch, you couldn't do it. And
locked them in the trunk or wherever.
It was a very different time. Even the road patrols were restricted as to what you could do. And of course you
could talk about some of those restrictions. Why not?
Unless somebody was, there were no speeding tickets written in the park then, unless somebody was running. I think probably maybe the two or three that I did write were, one was a Corvette that I clocked at was 98 miles an hour on the radar. And
look out, deer, here I come.
he did get a ticket, and we got by with it. But a lot of them were written would be thrown out by your supervisor. So it really got to the point that what's the use in writing them? It's not going to get past your immediate supervisor. And even other things like tremendous amount of poaching went on during the winter. And
especially on the north side.
Very often they were known people, and we knew where they were taking the deer, where they were processing them, but our supervisors would never allow us to do anything about it. If you caught one in the act or two, you could maybe get it to court. But not very often. I think the only time that we had that, two actually, we got into court. One was we stopped the car just a few minutes after a shot, and the rear of the car was covered in blood. I mean, all over it. And our direct supervisor called and said for one of us to stand there with the car and the other go get a search warrant. And we're, 40 miles from a search warrant in the middle of 2 o'clock in the morning. But fortunately at that time, another supervisor drove up and he looked at the blood on it and he said, open the trunk, and we did. They had a trunk full of weapons and a trunk full of deer. And honestly, the only reason that went to court is another supervisor had shown up, and we did damage to the car. That's the only reason it went to court. And the other incident,
you did damage when you opened the trunk.
Yeah. And the other was we stopped what appeared to be a fellow going fishing, but they had the tailgate was down in the back of the truck, and there was blood dripping off the tailgate. And there were 2 John boats in the back of the truck. And anyway, I stopped the car and went to the truck, and the fellow was with me that was actually in training at the time, went around the other side of the truck, and just as he got up the truck, someone moved under one of the boats, and there were 2 guys under the boat, both boats, with their deer that they had shot, holding guns pointed at both of us. And that one, because of the guns and the fact that they were pointing, went to court, but very, very few went to court. And very often the poachers were people who worked for the Park Service.
Or had.
So is that it? It's saving image, or why do you think prosecution was?
It was.
Well, you're talking about some early supervisors who actually grew up in the area, and a lot of the folks that
They were
David's talking
family.
about, some of them were. I don't want to stereotype.
No.
But there are families, that have got you can wind up with a third cousin. You can wind up with whoever. And when you're talking about a park where most of the original rangers started out from the area, you couldn't throw a rock without hitting somebody that was kin to somebody at the park, or who was, at least distant, or an in-law or an outlaw or whatever. So that made a big difference. And you're talking about from 1941, if for a person to retire with 30 years, they're going to go at least, 71. So, and usually longer. The guys tended to work longer than that. So you get into the 70s with people who were still related, who are related to some of the very first rangers at Mammoth Cave. And they didn't want to, it wasn't necessarily that they wanted to get their family in hot water, especially when at that time, even still in the 70s, bad feelings were still running over the park being established, because you still had that memory, that generation, that first generation memory of being moved off the park. Not so much now. Now we're into second and third and fourth generation memory of being told about it, but not necessarily living through it.
Very often then, promotions were not made because of anyone's ability. They were made because, well, this is still my cousin over here, and this is where he needs to be, and that's how you were promoted. And sometimes those people were just what you couldn't call sharp.
But not every ranger in the park had that local connection. Didn't. And it was honestly the ones who came in without the local connection, or with, I don't want to say it, but with college education, who would come in and were a little bit more worldly, handled things differently. They had a bigger perspective of life.
And it took a long time.
And the job. Yeah. And we, people think, well, nothing ever happens out at Mammoth Cave, but they do. I mean, you have accidents, you have road accidents.
People also go to national parks to do things that they would never do anywhere else. They come to commit suicide. They come to national parks to do things that just are not going to happen in other places.
Do we have a guy up on Joppa Road or something one time? Committed suicide, or was there to commit suicide?
No, that's his wife was there to kill him.
Oh, forgot. Got my stories mixed up on that one. But we have road, fatalities, and I do remember right after Becca was born, and I had just gone back to work at the campground. I was supervising the campground at the time because I had a split position where I worked 6 months in the cave interpreting and 6 months outside supervising the campground. And I enjoyed that position quite a bit, actually, especially, and then I had a 2-month furlough, which I didn't enjoy because I wasn't getting paid, but it was nice to be off with the baby. Well, right after I got back to work in September, after she was born, there was a call that there'd been a motor vehicle accident on Flint Ridge Road. And all of the law enforcement guys were across the river painting boundary. So they were all out in their snake gear and their tick gear and everything else because they're out in the woods painting trees and what have you. And it was going to take a while for them to get there. The only ranger on duty on the south side was David. So they left one person over to handle everything that happened during the day. And so a girl named Barbara Montgomery and I got in our truck because we were really the only responders. It was us and David, and he needed backup. Well, we were his backup. God bless him. So we get down there, and the car that was there, I remember getting there and seeing a guy and a girl sitting over on the side, and both of them were obviously very distraught. And I was like, well, where's David? I see his cruiser, but where's he? And then about that time, I see him raise up out of the car, and he was basically in there verifying that the young lady who was in her early 20s was deceased. So
that was sad too, because just a couple of years before that, I had her in the YCC
program. Yeah, she was she worked in that YCC program, and her uncle worked at the park.
Yeah.
So he showed up, not knowing who was in the accident. Yeah, so he showed up at me and looked at me. He said, Joy, I was standing there holding traffic, but he walked up to me and he said, that's my nephew over there. And we had a blanket around him because he was in shock. And he said, who's in there? And I said, well, his sister's in there. And he said, oh, it's my niece. I said, I'm sorry, Morris. She's gone. I mean, he wanted to know. He said, oh God, I need to get over to my sister. So he went to get some information from other people because I said, I'm not the one you need to talk to. And by the time he got there, though, to his sister's house to tell her about her daughter, the chief ranger had called and told her, which is really not the way to do it. I don't think it's not the way to do it now. But at that time, it was easier for him just to make the phone call, even though the lady's last name was the same as one of our maintenance foremen. I don't think he made the connection. And in this near area, you should make the connection that there's a chance they're kin to each
At
other.
that time, he didn't make a lot of connections. He kind of missed his retirement about.
Sometimes
3
people go a
years.
little bit longer than they should. Yeah. So there are tragedies like that happened, and they, you go on with them, but we don't. I know that there are other parks that have far more of them than we do.
That's what I was going to ask. Is this a typical thing that Mammoth has so much?
No. But I'm not going to play down what the guys have to deal with every day. They deal with a lot more than that I know about, or anyone else ever knew about, because when you're investigating or you're running, something, you're not telling everybody about it. So those guys get out and they do their thing, and they talk about it amongst themselves. But so they're this little isolated community that the rest of us look at like they think they're, but not really. And some of them are better at breaking that barrier than others. But and it helped for me that I had worked out in resource management and law enforcement. It's what I mean. Like when you spread yourself around in the park, it's just what I did. But also it's what helped me get up and not get up in the ranks in one park. I didn't just sit in one position all the time at one grade level. I was more than willing to try something new and get out and do that. So, you get people who are not so willing and they get complacent, but yet they're griping about the fact that they're not getting what they want. Well, you know what? Do something. You do it. You be assertive and you show people what you can do. We were talking about women earlier, in the Park Service, and I think it'd be unfair to leave this interview thinking that women all stuck together and women always supported one another, because that's not true. We found one thing that I had trouble with in the Park Service was cliques within the female group. And it tended to be between office women versus ranger women, office staff versus the women in the uniform. And some of the office women were in uniform, but it was between, it was different work classes. So the ladies who worked in the office tended to sometimes have problems with those of us who had authority within the park. They like to talk sometimes about us getting authority in the wrong way. And they talked about the fact that we are graded too high and they needed to be graded higher. It was about money. Which
is really odd, because most office workers were graded higher than the rangers.
They are now. They weren't before, but they are now. Now there are people in the office, the ladies who work in the office with their Monday, Friday work schedules and their typing and that sort of stuff. And they do more than that, but most of them are GS7s, whereas my staff were GS5s and had to work weekends and holidays, and so there's that issue. The women are not always as supportive of each other, and it sounds like I'm sour grapes right now too, just about that. It was so regrettable. Why can't everybody support each other? Why can't you celebrate each other's successes instead of looking down your nose at someone who got an upgrade, or thinking that because they're a supervisor they just don't understand what we do anymore? And some of these people I've been friends with since the beginning, but I moved up and they had trouble with that there had to be some reason that I moved up. There was even one rumor, I don't know if you knew this or not. George Gregory told me once that there was a rumor going around that I was having an affair with Ron Schweitzer.
Really?
Yeah. If I was going to have an affair, it sure wasn't going to be with Ron Schweitzer. He was our superintendent. I was like, what? No. Like, look at David. Look at Ron Schweitzer. No. Not going to happen.
So it would be nice if everybody could celebrate,
Yeah, exactly. Celebrate each other's successes why not?
What are some things that you, as either as an interpreter or law enforcement, that you really celebrate? Maybe a story you felt good about the way something turned out, or some advice you've given somebody, or a feedback you got, or from a staff or from a public?
Well, that big book right there next to you, it has a little bit of that. That's from my retirement dinner, and it's just some things that people wrote, you know, about ways that I helped them and ways that I impacted their life. I have almost 200 cards that were sent to me for my birthday this year, and a lot of the staff wrote in them ways that I had made a difference in their lives, things that I hadn't even thought about. But I guess the things that I take most pride in is the mentoring that I did with the staff, breaking barriers between supervisors and the front line, making it more invisible, you know, like breaking, it's not a glass ceiling, it was a glass wall, and getting people where we could all be on the same wavelength and talking. But also, I think I'm proudest of, as far as my accomplishments of research, you know, just starting to do original research at the park. That was not happening much at all when I got there. There were a couple of people who did a little bit, and they happened to be guys who went to law enforcement later on, like Henry and you and David. And I started researching African American history and other things as well, and things outside the park. I sort of pushed the history of the park's boundaries and got involved with Bell's Tavern out here at Park City and the connection between that and Mammoth Cave, which nobody knew really and nobody talked about. And then I got so excited about it and telling stories to people, and David, of course, was always involved in that too. It rubbed off on them. So now I've got staff who, well, they're not my staff anymore, but I still consider them a staff. They dig deep into everything. Every one of them has decided, you know, I'm like, if you want to keep your job, if you want to make sure that you stay here, you're not ever riffed, if you want to make sure that you've got a place here, that you get a job promotion, make yourself indispensable. Make yourself the go-to guy, the go-to girl for something. At least one thing, but preferably more than one. And that way, somebody's going to go, well, oh shoot though. If I put her over here, if I give her a furlough, that means for 1 or 2 months, we're not going to have this being done. So that was that kind of guidance that I would give them. A lot of folks that I helped start in the Park Service have gone on into other places in the Park Service and gone up. One of them was Tim Cash. I don't claim credit for Tim Cash. That actually goes more to Joe McGowan, who's now deceased. But Tim started out as a student aide at Mammoth Cave, and he's now the GS-14 out of Washington. But he lives in Glasgow and travels back and forth. And that's not something that would have happened before, but his family's in Glasgow. So he lives in Glasgow 3 weeks of the month, and he works from home, and then for a week of the month he has to be in DC. So he doesn't travel back and forth. That would never have happened before, because that's some money, you know. And Laura Peppers, she started out as a student aide, and I helped her through a lot of things, and now she just came back to Mammoth Cave National Park from Eastern Parks as the chief ranger, the new chief ranger. And I don't know if you've interviewed Laura yet, but you might want to think about Laura Peppers. She would be a good story.
She's coming on as chief of
law enforcement and visitor services, or whatever they're calling it now.
I talked to the acting
visitor protection
chief a couple of weeks ago, so I knew that she was coming in, but I didn't know her name.
Yeah, Laura Peppers. Great girl.
That's a big deal.
It's a very big deal
in our world here.
Yeah, and of course our superintendent, Sarah Craighead, but she's on detail right now in Atlanta. And she started at Mammoth Cave as well, but I didn't know. I had nothing to do with that. She did everything on. That's her. That's all her.
No comment.
But the law enforcement people who I didn't have anything to help with those guys. They do their thing. But the thing is, too, though, some of the people like David Alexander in law enforcement he started so young at the park, and he started in interpretation, but he always wanted to do law enforcement, and he guided cave tours for quite a while. But he was one of those people who was local, who had a dream, who wanted to move forward, wanted to work at the park. He wanted to work for the National Park Service, and I'm not sure, but I think maybe at one time he would have been happy to have worked somewhere else. But he's made all of us so proud with being on the honor guard, the national. Oh my gosh, that's such an honor. It's just so important, and it speaks so highly of David and Mammoth Cave National Park. I just can't say enough about how special that is that he did that. But having said that, I also remember that David Alexander, who went into a cave tour on a trog tour with another seasonal in training named Katina Buster. She'd been there for quite a while, but she was just learning trog, the cave tour for the kids, and he lost her on the tour. So I remember that David Alexander as well. He had like kids with him. I don't remember how many they had. But somehow or other, Katina didn't stay up with him. She wound up lost on the trog route. So he comes out, and we had to go back in and look. Actually, Henry Hallman had to go in looking for her with David, and they found her. She was blubbering, and then they brought her back up to I don't think she was crying in the cave, but she started crying after they found her from nerves. And anyway, so the next day I remember watching him come in from the parking lot to work, and he was carrying a red rose with the little water bubble thing at the end. He brought a rose in for Katina because he felt so bad that he'd lost her in the cave. Actually, she lost herself.
Right.
But he's a really good guy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a good life.
It's been a very good life. Met a lot of great people at the park. Still, some of them are still there. David, and you have your stories about those who are good at certain things, some who aren't, and Rich Caldwell with his fear of snakes. Everybody's got their little thing that they don't like. Or I remember Rich Caldwell once jumped on the hood of a vehicle because David a snake got loose outside.
I let him go. He didn't get loose.
True.
I thought Rich was in the truck.
And he was out, and David threw the snake out of a bag or whatever it was.
It was a timber rattler, and it was pretty good sized snake, but I thought Rich just had stayed in the truck.
And Rich got out, and lo and behold, his little long, lanky Missouri body wound up on top of the vehicle. As soon as he saw it, he does not like snakes. He's funny. He's retired now, too. Everyone that was there at the park when I started working has either retired or has passed on, with the exception of Vicki and Bobby Carson, Joe Duvall, Kevin Neff. I think that's it. Everybody else is gone.
Bob's tourist still on.
No, Bob's not working anymore.
Oh, he's not?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
So that's it. And Joe Duvall and Kevin were both seasonals for quite a long time, and now they're permanent staff. And then, of course, Joe, as you know, is considering retirement this year. That man's got more than 50 years not 50 total years, but 50 years his career spans the National Park Service in either full-time, part-time, or intermittent status. And he graduated. He retired from teaching, but he's going to have a full retirement from the National Park Service as well because of all the years that he had in, and he was able to buy back his seasonal time. So he's going to be he and his wife are going to be doing pretty well, I think, in retirement, I hope. And I hope he has long health for a lot of years. And knowing Joe, I think he will. I think he'll see his 90s and maybe even beyond. I'm not kidding. Mm-hmm. The man is like the Energizer Bunny. He just keeps going. I hope I keep going too, just like the Energizer Bunny.
I hope you will too.
Yeah.
What would you give advice to somebody who wanted to think about the Park Service and, talk to you? You've had a pretty good career. What would you say to somebody about advancing themselves?
I would say don't allow yourself to think you're too good to do something. Allow yourself to try things and work harder than the money. And do what you can. Don't feel like you have to have a paying job to get your foot in the door. Volunteer when you can. Keep that resume full of activities and paying jobs. I think young people worry that there are jobs that are beneath them and that they're going to look bad on their resume. Well, that may be true, but if they're working, they may think that they look bad, like working at Taco Bell, which I did. List those because they do help, and they'll tell you go back at least 10 years. Well, yeah, you need to go back, but also when you're talking about what your work has been, put in all that volunteer time. Anything like that you've done that has made a difference for someone or some organization, that will get you just as much credit as paying jobs do. And the rest of it, we look at any supervisor with some sense will say, wasn't too good for the job, took the job, needed a paycheck, worked at Taco Bell. Nothing against Taco Bell, but it just happened to be where I worked for a while in 1979. Work, you gotta don't have any downtime where it looks like you were just sitting on your laurels or living off mom and dad. Keep something going all the time. Don't let there be a break in that. And then show that you've tried to get your own training, like CPR training, first aid training somewhere else. Don't wait for someone to give it to you. Go out and seek it so that you can come to the table with those skills already in hand. Mm-hmm. And don't give up. Keep trying until you feel like you can't try anymore.
So you've always been a seeker yourself?
Yeah, I think so. You're right. Hadn't thought about it that way. Isn't there a seeker on some movie or storybook or something where there's somebody's called the Seeker?
Is that a Harry Potter thing?
I don't know.
I could say.
But yeah, and I've taught my daughters, David and I both have taught our daughters to reach for whatever your dream is, and money's not the begin all and end all. You find what you enjoy doing. It doesn't matter what the money is, as long as you can make your way, pay your bills, live within your means, but do what you love. Because it is true, if you're doing what you love, you don't really work a day in your life. It's true.
The only catch there is what you love very often has some very hard work involved.
That's true. It does have a lot of hard work, but the thing is, you enjoy doing it. And when you enjoy it, you can go to sleep with nothing but the best feelings in your heart and your own self, and about yourself. Pride in what you do and being an honorable person, Mr. Mayor.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts?
I hope not.
It was good. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.